going to ask a few questions of my fellow panelists here. We're all going to answer, and then we'll open it up to questions. And the first question kind of encompasses two things that we've already talked about, but I think I'll just combine them, which is, why are we writing about war? Why are we writing fiction about war? Roy, you want to begin?
Sure. I don't know if this thing is on or what, but I'll just project. Why fiction about war? So, two parts. Why fiction? Why war? Fiction. I mean, fiction because I think we talked about this some, but I think it offers a space for imaginative empathy in a way that nonfiction doesn't do. So, if I write a memoir, I write a opinion piece, or I write reportage, it's me telling you what I saw, what happened, what the facts are. And there's all kinds of great ways to massage that problem, different modes of journalism and storytelling and so on, and that's all wonderful. But with fiction, immediately, there's the question of where the truth is at. Because you have the author, you have characters, and potentially a narrator, and so on. But definitely, so as soon as you go into that place of the story, you don't have to agree with the author, you don't have to agree with the characters. There's a space where you can empathize with people you may not even want to talk to in real life, and you can participate in and identify with experiences that would be completely alien to you otherwise, and might even experiences that you wouldn't even be able to walk away from. In fiction, it's sort of a safe space to do that. Why war? Well, the one obvious reason is because I was in one. Another one is because it takes us to those places, those extreme places in human existence, human choices. It's an intense space, and it connects. It intensifies and connects so many different things in our day-to-day lives, and just puts them in a new frame. So that's a big one. I could keep talking, I'll stop.
Joy,
Helen and I met 2 years ago, and essentially wondered. Helen, what's fascinating to me is the makeup, the background of this panel. Helen teaches journalism and writes fiction and non-fiction. Roy is a veteran. I formerly studied international relations and political philosophy. So in other words, none of us have a formal training in writing, the MFA. And Helen and I wondered what world that storied writing program in Columbia lived in when there had been these wars raging around us, and American fiction is just so solipsistic. It's as if the rest of the world doesn't exist. Personally, 3 things determined my transition to fiction. I was a graduate student when I witnessed the collapse of the Soviet satellites in the Soviet Union in first person. I just happened to be there. Essentially wrecked the dissertation I was writing and turned into my first novel, which is set in Eastern Europe. And I was thinking about my second novel in 1999, and sitting in front of the TV watching the sea of blonde heads and blue eyes, raising their hands and waving Bush into candidacy, and this was in Minneapolis. And decided that I would write my second novel, a very short novel set in Germany during the firebombing of February 1945. And began to do research. And 7 years later, that very short novel had turned into this mammoth project that I'm still working on. But one of the things I discovered is the fact that Germans, this whole business about Germans being Hitler's willing executioners was a lie. And it's what mythology is presented to us in the manner of history. And I keep a book that I'm going to show to you as a kind of talisman to remind me why I write what I do. And this is called The Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. It's published by Alfred A. Knopf, and the publication date is September 28, 1933. In other words, 6 months after Hitler came to power, 500,000 Germans were already in concentration camps, right? So this is 1933, and it gives you all kinds of details about what was going on. And the United States and the West essentially supported Hitler through this period right up to Kristallnacht in 1937, turning a blind eye to what was going on inside Germany, because Hitler was our guy against the real bad guy, which was, of course, the communists and Stalin. It was only after Kristallnacht in 1937 that realization dawned that perhaps this is not the right way to go in terms of foreign policy. One of the reasons my project became so large was I became fascinated with the problem of complicity, and have been haunted ever since by what's been going on in the States. That book is called Homeland, and I'm going to have to change the title for obvious reasons. But what it does is it alternates chapters between Germany between 1927 and 1945, and chapters set in present-day America, to show you the kind of parallels in terms of what's going on. And personally, having lived through 20 years of the seamless transition from the war on communism to the war on fundamentalist Islam, I find it impossible to ignore this relentless killing of a particular cultural segment of humanity that comprises of 1.5 billion people, and carry on writing fiction as entertainment, as business as usual. I find it shocking, and I think any writer who writes books in oblivion to the daily slaughter is participant in that slaughter, in as much as all of us in our quotidian lives make cost-benefit analyses in terms of the kind of opposition, the kind of voice we want to have in the present context for things like drones, for instance, or things like what Edward Snowden has revealed to us in terms of this, the mass surveillance. We can't go on the way we've been going on. I think we are living through a time of systemic collapse. And I think fiction, for me, has the virtue of what I call the 3 C's. The complexity of the historical macrocosm is, through fiction, collapsed into a situational microcosm, where you can communicate to the lay reader why his understanding of what's going on, for instance, in Afghanistan, or Iraq, or Syria, or Libya, or Somalia, or Yemen, or Africa, or any of the 178 countries where the United States has bases is important to us. In other words, fiction is able, on a human level, to do what nonfiction isn't. See, nonfiction has an end date. A book written in 2008, a very good book on the Taliban, stops at 2008. I believe a good book of fiction can transcend that date and make it universal. It can tell you that the present conflict is part of a pattern, and that each one of us needs to wake up and not understand only through analysis, which is what nonfiction does very well, but understand through empathy, through compassion. And this is the second thing that fiction does. I believe a fiction writer has a responsibility to bring compassion and empathy into a book, to communicate to someone who hasn't been to Afghanistan, who hasn't experienced a drone attack, who hasn't experienced being in an American company, people to buy 19-year-olds from the heartland who've never been out of, wherever, Peoria, suddenly put into the wilds of Afghanistan and not just asked to fight, but to govern. It's a complexity and compassion. And I think the final thing is what keeps me going, which is I think fiction basically takes you by the collar. War fiction or political fiction, and God knows we don't have a tradition of political fiction in the States, takes you by the collar and tells you, look, there are things that are more important than entertainment. And for the longest time, for marketing or other imperatives, fiction in the West has been driven by entertainment imperatives. And I don't care whether it's literary fiction or commercial fiction. It is fantasy land. And we can't keep doing that anymore. European fiction, especially the more esoteric European fiction, today, doesn't matter who the writer is, reads as if, the walls of the world stop at Europe. American fiction seems to be turning inward. It's just so inward directed, and the implications of a foreign policy that's been carrying on for 50 years, with its wedge being war fighting, is horrific. And I think we as writers, especially as fiction writers, have a responsibility to communicate to readers who might be attracted by our language or be attracted by our writing to think and to feel, and to know that it is ethically wrong that even as this session is going on, some child in the backwoods of Afghanistan or the backwoods of Pakistan or the backwoods of Yemen, or pick your country, is going to find it difficult to sleep because of this incessant buzzing that is the drone in the sky that might or might not one day blow him up by various techniques that have now been denounced by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch as war crimes. Finally, I have a folder, and I often use it in presentations, of children who died as a result of drone attacks and air attacks over the last 10 years, and I call it Obama. And I think what's happened over the last 10 years, or what should have happened, is to strip us of any pretensions we may have to there being a liberal-conservative divide in terms of American foreign policy, and really start thinking in terms of political alternatives. And you don't need to watch Russell Brand on the BBC day before yesterday call for a revolution. I mean, we really need to wake up. And I think that is part of why I write fiction, and that is part of what fiction ought to be doing, along with entertainment. Sorry, that was a hair.
I'm doubling up as a moderator and a panelist here, so I get to answer my own question. It's really weird, but I'll try and make it brief. When we invaded Iraq, it had the same effect on me that 9/11 had on a lot of other artists and writers I knew, which is that it suddenly made everything I was working on seem irrelevant and unimportant. I had to do something about this war, which felt extremely wrong to me from the beginning. So I started off with non-fiction. I was looking for what soldiers had to say about the war, what Marines had to say about the war, the first ones who were coming back, trying to go in with an open mind. And that's how I discovered women soldiers and the plight of women soldiers and how many of them were on the front lines and being wounded and being harassed and raped at the same time. So I did my non-fiction on that. But in the course of that, I learned how many soldiers, men and women, but regardless of their politics going in, had serious doubts about this enterprise in Iraq once they saw it close up. And that was not something we were hearing about in the press, the conscience of the soldiers and the political turn against the war. But as I was interviewing these veterans, they would often reach a moment in recounting their experiences where they couldn't talk anymore because their memories were too traumatic, They either couldn't or wouldn't talk, or they'd literally have panic attacks, not be able to talk. And I came to feel that it was in those silences that the true inner story of war is experienced. It's where it lies. It's what the soldiers were feeling inside. I also wanted to pay attention to Iraqis, whose voices have continued to be almost silenced here. So I started interviewing Iraqi refugees to get their side of it. And because of the silences, and because I felt that I wanted to get deeply into both sides, to reach the human beings, to counteract the stereotypes of soldiers being all either heroes or dupes, the stereotypes of Iraqis being all fanatics, ignorant and illiterate or wrong. To reach the humans, and that's where fiction goes. So that's what made me turn to Sand Queen. I wanted to awaken the compassion in everyone who reads it. I want it as a way of awakening us all, including myself, to our own complicity, because I think compassion is where it begins. When we can stop seeing people as the enemy or as dupes or as untouchable heroes, and we see them as people like us and what they're going through. And so that's really my mission, put in basic words. I'm writing a trilogy, or trying to write a trilogy, about the Iraq War that continues for some 10 years and follows up what happens to soldiers and veterans and Iraqis 10 years later and as it goes on. So that's what I'm doing now in Afghanistan, coming into it. I wanted to go back to the veterans' point of view of this for a bit, which is you touched on, I think, very well on what fiction can do and how it liberates you from yourself and your own experience and telling people what you already know. But since you said earlier you're kind of representing 14 authors, can you say any more about why you think the authors, all these authors in here, have turned to fiction rather than just writing memoir about their experiences at war?
I would be reluctant necessarily to speak for all these different writers, although it's it's a conversation we've had, and there are different. They have different reasons. I think for turning to a fiction, and some of them have written memoirs. Owie Bazel's in there, and my co-editor Matt Gallagher, both have very good memoirs about their experience in Iraq. I mean, one thing I would say that on the topic of turning to fiction, especially as a veteran coming out of the war, and it has to do with I guess sort of what you were just talking about being able to explore different sides of an issue, different sides of a thing. And both of your novels feature both American soldiers and what we call local nationals, right? An Iraqi and Afghan. And to go back to that question of fiction and its possibilities for encompassing many different truths, many different perspectives in one story, in one narrative. I think there's an appeal in that for a lot of my, definitely for a lot of my fellow veterans in here, in Fire and Forget. In the possibility that offers, both to explore other viewpoints on an experience you had, and to sort of alienate yourself from your own experience. Again, it's that sort of that safe space that opens up. I think, I don't know if there's if I wanted to write something that changed policy, I don't think I would write fiction. I think I would write memoir. I think I would write a op-eds. I think I would. I mean, there are veterans who are involved in politics in different ways. I mean, both. You know, there's a cultural issue. We're a long way from, you know, Uncle Tom's Cabin and even, you know, Sinclair's The Jungle. But even more, I think there's a possibility in fiction for not for judging, but for exploring the human condition in the horrible things we do, in the wonderful things we do, in the tragic choices we make, in the horrible mistakes we make. And I think that requires a certain willingness to suspend judgment. And I think working on that, working through that, is another appeal for veterans who may have done things that they have a hard time carrying.
Mm-hmm.
Fiction opens up a space where those kinds of things can be explored without having to judge them right away.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
You know, the 1950s saw a slew of books on the Second World War in all of the participant countries. Many books in Germany were published by generals and so forth, to very interested readership. But the only two books that were banned were by a German veteran called Gert Ledig, who wrote a couple of novels. And it's always interested me that in Adenauer's Germany, which was very centrist and trying to put, you know, kind of close the door on the whole Nazi experience, memoirs were acceptable. But these two books, which have been republished in translation by NYRB, were banned, simply because the truths they presented were perhaps too horrific for the audience to contend with, in terms of, you know, a counter to your argument that if you wanted to influence policy, you'd write a memoir. It's also been personally very interesting to me that my book, The Watch, has been criticized as both being pro-American and anti-American by reviewers, which means that as a fiction writer, as a novelist, I have done my job, because I see my job as being not to harangue the way I have done here, but to get out of the story and present different viewpoints, even ones that are totally inimical to me, and let the reader decide. Not be the talking head, but simply present war for the essential horror it is, a human experience in its most concentrated in terms of life and death, good and bad, good and evil, and coming to terms with who you really are. So yeah.
I'll just pick up a little bit on that, and I'm going to open it up to questions, because I really agree. And my favourite review of Sand Queen was being accused critically of humanising the enemy, which had so many layers to it, since the Iraqis weren't, remember we were supposed to go liberate them, they weren't even supposed to be the enemy, but the idea of humanising human horrors. But also that I think it's very sad that fiction is not seen as politically important in the way it once was. And I suppose another reason that I write what I'm writing is because I want to reclaim it as such. I want what you said to be really true, that people will still turn to fiction for an examination of our morals. I mean, Faulkner said that what fascinated him about war was that it showed the human heart in conflict with itself. In war, human beings are up against not only life and death, but morality in all its complexities. They're up against their own souls. And whether you are, whichever side of it you're on, whether you're occupied or the occupier. There are challenges all the time to what it means to try and remain a good or morally centered person. That to me as an artist and as it fascinates me in that way, but I think it's important to us as human beings to examine our consciences all the time and broadcasts that into a relief more than any other story. And you could, it also enlarges compassion. Then I wonder if some of that, because I read a lot of veterans who tried to bring alive or have in their writing Iraqi characters or Afghani characters, and tried to bring alive a very violent bully of a sergeant or a superior, to try and understand them from the inside. That's another thing that fiction does, at least if it's good. No two-dimensional people, no all villains, no all saints, and that's also builds compassion. So I think fiction has a role in all these ways that are terribly important to us as a society. Anyway, it's late. I think it's question time, isn't it? At least, yes. So we'll do that. Please ask whatever you'd like.
Question for Roy. I like what you said a lot about creating that space for empathy. And I also wondered, have you written about experience of women soldiers in your writing? Are there men veterans that are writing about their experience with women soldiers in that problem?
That's a great question, and I would have to say I have not. The novel that I've written about the Iraq War does deal, has a third of it's about an Iraqi, but it's, I don't have women soldiers in that. I would have to point to my good friend and co-author in here, Phil Cly, who the novel he's working on now is about a female soldier. I don't know all the details, but much of it's from her point of view, and it has to do with the culture of rape in the military. So I know Phil's working on that, and there may be others as well. But yeah, and I mean, we have Mary Kalinowski, who's a female veteran in the collection. She's working on a novel herself, so she can speak for herself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very thoughtful. I find myself wishing that I would have the faith in human nature that you seem to exhibit. Again, remember from World War II experience, someone who for number one, it's a proximity. If you're being hit by a sledgehammer, you have a different gestalt of the situation than if you happen to be a bystander in either where the sledgehammer is going on, or even, as you were mentioned, in a country that happens to wield the sledgehammer, but far away. And fiction has been written for thousands of years, and I don't think there's been an absence of war in all those thousands of years. So I think that you're rightly concerned. I'm just not as optimistic that this can be changed in a particular way. I remember just one thing came to my mind again, and that's Adorno's warning that poetry should never be written after Auschwitz.
I'm glad you.
And let me just finish that. You pay attention. And number two, for those of us who were there, Adorno was sitting in New York or California. So it's, again, it's a situation.
Yeah. My counter to Adorno is he was writing that at the same time as Paul Celan was actually writing poetry.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So which made nonsense of his pronouncement.
That's exactly what I was doing.
In terms of proximity, that's like asking, I've never held a gun in my life. I've never worn a uniform, right? So what right do I have to actually smuggle myself into the head of an American soldier, for instance, or an Afghan tribal person? But does a novelist who makes a lot of money writing vampire fiction necessarily go around writing people, right? Or does Hilary Mantel need to live in the times of Henry VIII to actually have that kind of proximity? I think this is precisely why fiction is important. And I'll tell you why, despite everything I do have, although believe me, I've had my despairing moments, kind of waving my fist at the sky and doing the whole joke thing. What happened this summer with, in this country, right, of all countries, with people from both sides of the political spectrum saying, no, going to war in Syria is ridiculous, and actually forcing a rethink of that policy is remarkable. I think, talking about Gestalt, we are living through what one might call a paradigm shift, where because of our own personal problems with the dominant system, financial problems with debt, problems with employment, we are beginning to realize that everything isn't hunky-dory, and we are, all of us, looking around, flailing around, if one might go that far, for answers. And I think fiction provides those answers. Principled fiction, one doesn't necessarily have to write a book that features war as its centerpiece to actually communicate the real costs of war. You could write a book set in the Midwest with the war playing out wherever, at the same time communicating what that war, that distant war, is doing to the society. What it is doing to the ethics of surviving within that society. And a lot of this was taking place in the late Victorian age, especially after the Boer War, when people were writing domestic novels, but at the same time reflecting on a system that was no longer what it had appeared to be. And I think we're there now.
And then came World War I.
And then came World War I, and I'm not saying, that this is why one must write, because we are in the 21st century. We shouldn't even be discussing topics like the participation of women as combat fighters. Why are we there at all? Why do we have bases in 178 countries? And I keep slipping into the we, although I'm an Indian citizen, right? But it doesn't matter. I mean, this is happening. And unless we write about it, we might as well write another night circus.
I want to. Oh, do you mind if I jump in?
Go ahead.
I want to say, I totally agree with Joydeep that part of what's wonderful and potential and great about fiction is that you don't have to experience the thing to write it. Like that imaginative leap, that empathetic leap is just key to the whole process of art in language as I conceive it. And I want to see your Adorno and raise you a Benjamin. So
I'm not defending it.
So there's a I think it's from Theses on the Philosophy of History, Walter Benjamin, who as we know, committed suicide on the French-Spanish border because he had been turned back trying to escape the Nazis. And he wrote, there's no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And I think about that a lot, and I think it's absolutely true. But the inverse is true as well. And this is a darker and scarier thought to sit with. There's no document of barbarism that is not at the same time a document of civilization. And that's the sort of human condition yeah, that I think we can get.
I thought also though that you weren't really asking us how we can write about it if we haven't gone through it. You were saying that, you know, but I think you were explaining a little bit why Americans feel so distant from these wars that we
That's one
and,
thing
and how to make
is
them
that I
feel.
was wishfully thinking that you're right. There was a movement.
Yeah.
As a matter of
Well, I mean, there might be a certain amount of pie in the sky about at least what we're trying to do. But I think you can't be an artist without indulging in some dreams. But I did want,
Or nightmares, right?
Or
I mean,
nightmares.
I think what we're trying to do is make you very, very uncomfortable. Offering you an alternative to embedded journalism, right?
Yeah.
Offering an alternative that actually strips away the facade and shows you that it isn't, you know, these young heroes tramping through a barbarian wasteland.
But I did want to pick up what you said about the effects at home, because that's actually where I am, what I'm writing about now. It bothers me that that so many Americans feel so distant from the war the wars that we're fostering. And I grew up I was born just after World War II in London, and as a child I saw bomb buildings around. I didn't live through the war, but it was real in a way that it's not real. Even that is more real than many Americans go through. But you know, the effect on our economy, on our morality, on our youth, on our small towns, on the families of veterans who come home, the ones who come home wounded either psychologically or physically, is huge. And there's a lot to write about now, and I guess part of my hope is that I'll wake people up to realizing what these costs of war are, and to be more questioning about the next one, which it looks like we are. These were Syria.
There's so much you guys have been saying that's really, really interesting, but one thing I just wanted to sort of leap in to talk a little bit about the mission of fiction writer, any kind of writer or thinker. But I mean, I think we have this, you know, on the basis of what you were saying, there's this hope that somehow we can perfect the world. We can never perfect the world. We can never eliminate barbarism. All we can do, I think, is speak out for compassion, empathy, for civilization against an endless onslaught from barbarism, and that's just the human condition. And so, even though we cannot rid the world of war, we cannot rid the world of evil people, I think it's our duty to constantly speak out in every way that we can against those evils, without the expectation that we'll eliminate them. I think the notion that somehow our work is worthless if we don't change the world, well, maybe we do change the world. If the work is worthless if we don't eliminate the barbarians is a false expectation that will never, ever, ever happen.
Yeah, well, this is what I meant by, you know, fiction introducing an element of complexity, in the sense that too much of the Weltanschauung, the worldview of the last 40 years, especially in the West, has been very black and white. And I think what fiction does precisely is to dwell in the gray areas, right? It gives you alternatives that are not comfortable, that are not safe, that force you to reconsider actions that are being taken by your government in your name, right? Actions that you personally would never venture upon. And once again, at a time when most journalism is systematically compromised, ethically compromised, and academia, on the other hand, is basically, you know, it's off in this postmodern ivory tower somewhere where, you know, one reads a sentence and wonders what language one is reading. I mean, it's just completely sort of made themselves beside the point. It's up to, you know, those of us with whatever tools we have, and I don't mean writers are the only ones, you know, musicians, artists, whoever, you know, even a well-meaning banker, perhaps, you know, subsidizing an independent journalistic enterprise like the one that Greenwald and Jeremy Scale and Laura Poitras are venturing upon. You know, if a guy who makes his money being the founder of eBay wants to do that, all strength to him. But people who have realized that we can't go on this way, And we're just one of those tools, you know. I mean, we are unfortunately the kind of people who can't shut up and would be the first people to be put in concentration camps. It's also very interesting to me that despite, you know, protestations to the contrary, all of these wars have taken place over the last 20 years without a single American writer actually exiling himself as the Germans did through the 1930s, right? I'm sure 40 years from now someone's going to write a book about Bush's willing executioners. What kind of response are we going to be able to give to our grandchildren? You know, what did you do when these kids were being blown up by drones? Why didn't you speak up?
To piggyback a little bit on what you were saying about how far away the wars are from the majority of Americans, a lot of organizations, Words After War, the War Writers Campaign, StoryCorps doing Oral History Project, they're all doing that, I think, to bridge that military-civilian divide. And I was wondering, maybe, I think to all of you, but most especially, I guess, Roy, do you think fiction or nonfiction better achieves that goal of actually getting the civilian population to really see what's going on?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I mean, my suspicion is that there's a bigger audience generally for nonfiction, especially things like StoryCorps and like Opportunity, things like on NPR or whatever. There's just a bigger place in the culture we live in today for personal narratives, memoirs, nonfiction, things like that, to get that story across. So I would say in those terms, it's probably going to be nonfiction. But that being said, I still want to believe, anyway, in the power of fiction to bring the experience to life, whatever that means, but to bring the reader across whatever divide, you know, whatever cultural divides we might set up. I want to believe that fiction can do that in a way that that is its own special provenance and is more powerful than nonfiction.
I would say I sort of experimented by writing one non-fiction book and one novel about women soldiers serving in Iraq. So I've seen the different kinds of reactions. I would say the non-fiction got more attention in terms of actually changing policies and people using it to, you know, inspire the Invisible War, the documentary that was nominated for an Oscar, which then went to Capitol Hill and actually got some laws changed and things. And that would be hard to make that come out of fiction. But in terms of reader reaction, I would say Sand Queen moved people about the plight of women soldiers and Iraqis much more deeply than my non-fiction. And one of the reasons is this. When you read the stories of actual people, and especially in the context of sexual assault, a very common reaction is, it's that woman's problem. She was incompetent, she made a mistake, she's kind of crazy. There's very quick victim blaming and then dismissing going on. That doesn't happen with a novel. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about fiction can go much deeper inside than a real person will let you go. I really believe that, and it brings the reader with you. So when you read this novel, you're really in the feet. You're occupying the bodies and the minds of the characters in a way that it doesn't happen with non-fiction. So I argue for fiction now in terms of really
Can I
understanding.
also step in and respond to that as a non-American, right? Between 1926 and 1929, there was a whole slew of memoirs published in England. Goodbye to all that, Undertones of War. And then in 1929, there was a reaction to that, led by no other than T. Lawrence of Arabia, who basically denounced the self-pitying tone of these memoirs. I refer to that because one of the things that most disturbs me as a non-American about memoirs that are published, right, by mostly very young soldiers with little to no cultural experience of the lands they have fought in. And it's enormously unfortunate that the writers who have set that tone during the Vietnam War have really indulged in this. What's his name? O'Brien? Tim O'Brien, right? I mean, I can't read his books. I find it impossibly solipsistic and self-pitying, right? And the memoirs through all of these projects that come out, right, they are very, very close to the heart. But they are about this young American man or woman's experience of war. Where are the people they killed? Where are the casualties? 4 million dead in Vietnam, 1 million dead in Iraq and counting. All of these countless faces that just blur, right? And all we do here in this country is read about Joe Schmo's PTSD. I'm sorry, that sounds very harsh. And I totally sympathize and empathize with the PTSD problem. In fact, I'm going to write about it. But there is something enormously skewed about a whole societal reaction to a war it has inflicted on another society, being to then return and navel gaze. So in that in those terms, I think both fiction and non-fiction have a role in making people understand. But fiction has the necessary role, principled fiction, because precisely it brings in the other, right? It's not all about the self.
Do you have a question?
I'm not even sure I can put into words what okay, the difference between, in particular, what you said about writing about women in the war as non-fiction, as opposed to that women in the war in fiction. And if it's true what you say, that the public gravitates toward the non-fiction, I'm sorry, toward the fiction, then it seems to me that's because the public has an enormous psychological problem, an inability to face reality. And the problem with that being true, if they prefer the non-fiction, is that if you read the non-fiction, you don't particularly you can empathize with it, but you don't necessarily take the position of, now what am I going to do about it? But if you can relate to and empathize with, did I just say non-fiction?
Yeah.
But if I can, I said I have trouble doing this. You can't. But if people can relate to the memoir, then they know, and I'm saying they're adverse to that, but if they could, that puts them in a position of, now that I know about this and I know that it's true, now what am I going to do about it? So it's almost like I don't know that I agree with what you're saying about about the fiction, because the fiction is a story, it's like the Big Bad Wolf.
No, see, there I have to say, there I totally disagree with you. I think the idea that fiction is not real, that it's not reality, that it's just a fairy tale, to use your analogy, is a complete misreading of fiction. I'm arguing the opposite. I'm arguing that fiction gets closer to the heart and closer to the truth than non-fiction, because when you're telling a story of real people, they have all kinds of barriers between them and you that you can't penetrate. Sometimes those barriers are willful, sometimes they're unconscious. But there's a limit to how far one person can get inside another actual human being. There's no limit with fiction.
Yeah. I hear that that's what you're trying to say, that's what you believe. I agree with that. At the same time, I think it creates, because it's fiction, in the mind that doesn't want to accept the horror as true, in storyline we accept it, we commiserate.
Let me prove.
So you're saying some people use it as an excuse to say, this can't really be true.
Well, actually, can I prove you wrong? Have you read War and Peace?
Actually, no.
Okay, well, let's hypothetically say many people in this room have read War and Peace, right? How many people in this room have read contemporary Russian memoirs or journalistic accounts of the Napoleonic Wars? We know that period through War and Peace. These characters are real to us. It doesn't matter. I understand where you're coming from. I had a book review, right, that said the reviewer knew how I went about writing my novel because I extensively interviewed American soldiers and then wrote the novel. The person hadn't interviewed me. I hadn't spoken to a single American soldier when I read the novel, when I wrote the novel. I went with the finished manuscript to American soldiers to prove my details right. Now, this is a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that, well, how can he write a story he hasn't experienced unless he's actually done these extensive interviews? Well, the proof is in the pudding, right?
I think you're talking about the book now.
No, I'm talking about the book.
We've been given the signal, so we've got to wrap up here. You want to say?
I think, I would say, we tend to be deeply confused about the relationship between reality and fiction. As a culture, as human beings, as sort of cognitively flawed animals. And I think that's great, because it means I can write fiction stories that really affect people about real things, but they're made up. I guess, which is to say that I think it's precisely this sort of, I don't know, the suspension of disbelief or this disconnect between fiction and reality that opens up this room for playing and for empathizing and for reaching people.
But action.
Action,
It's
not for me.
I think societally, we've bought into the myth that there is such a thing as nonfiction. There is no such thing as nonfiction.
Right.
There is no such thing. It's any memoir, any journalistic account is written with a point of view. The account in the New Yorker about the raid on Osama bin Laden is fiction. The movie made out of that raid is fiction, but we accept it as fact, right? It's supposed to be a documentary evidence. I'm sorry. It's not fiction. It's not non-fiction. You can write non-fiction about the same event from entirely different points of view. The memoirs that are so popular in the culture today, they're fiction. A lot of them have been proved to be fiction. James Fry going on Oprah, admitting that he was writing fiction. It is a point of view. There is
history is fiction too.
Well, exactly. Which
I want to give you a concrete example of a discussion that happened like this among readers. It was some blog thing. Somebody wrote, I read Sand Queen, it can't be true, it can't really be this bad, can it? This must be all made up, it's just a story. And then a lot of other people, actually women veterans, wrote and said, yes, this is true, this is what it's like. And therefore there was a discussion that happened, that was action, and that first reader must have learned. And in the back of the book, I have organizations to contact for anybody who wants to actually turn into an activist. So there's that too.
You're saying action and conversation is the same thing. When the conversation
can lead to action.
If it does.
Not always does. But I don't think the role of all art is to always result in action, as we were saying earlier.
I would say conversation is, it's a kind of action, and so is reading. Reading is, it's a thing you do. This is action. We're, pushing air through our necks. If you'll let me finish. Pascal noted that most human problems are caused by not being able to sit still. If we could just sit still, we could solve a lot of problems. The more people I can get to sit still and read a book, I think the better off we all are.
Before we go into what's real and what isn't real, could we?
You know, like in a way, like you're offering something different to your reader when it's a novel or something. It's like the holder is suddenly a little bigger, a little bit like what you're saying. You know, the reader is going to have to take time at their own pace to take in more and more and more information in a way that is more like art, and that consideration has been given to all the different aspects of the story that you're going to give your reader. So it's a very different experience that's more, you know, slowed down at your own pace, and sometimes more larger if it's working and the writer is, because it's so interesting that fiction is so related to direct experience anyway. I mean, you say it's all maybe a made-up story, but it's not going to be very powerful fiction if it doesn't contain you know, knowledge of the subject and is thoroughly researched that takes it back to non-fiction. But when you make a piece of fiction, it becomes the art element is the holder, you know, the container for a larger space.
And I think you know, this has been a useful point, because I think this is what is dangerous today in the writing tradition in America, which is that fiction is dismissed as escapist fantasy. And what we are trying to do here is connect to an older tradition, right? I mean, people read The Magic Mountain as a comment on the disaster that was the First World War. It wasn't just a story. Right? War and Peace wasn't just a story. For me, it's academic, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. It isn't a question of either or. It's a question of waking up consciousness. But I believe at a point where non-fiction alternatives have become fundamentally compromised. As writers of fiction, we can't just indulge in Victorian fantasies anymore. You know, we need to engage with reality.
I mean, reality is unlimited, you know.
Well, you could say that fiction writers have been engaging with realities that are comfortable. And what we're trying to do is introduce these vast areas that are part of our quotidian world, but are not dealt with, right?
I'm thinking Arundhati Roy should be here as well, because she was someone who wrote that amazing novel, The God of Small Things, that dealt with a very well-researched material, and then apparently, was that the last piece of fiction that she did? She became an activist after, I mean, she probably was always an activist while she was writing, but she would just be an interesting person to read.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up with a quote from George Eliot, who showed the way the kind of power that novels used to have and the respect with which novels were regarded. When she wrote, it was in Daniel Deronda, was that the one with Hester and then Hester. Anyway, she said, poor Hester, she knew nothing of life because she had never read a novel.